It was just another ordinary school day. The sun was shining, the air was crisp, and the playground buzzed with laughter. Emma Carter, only 8 years old, was the kind of child who lit up any space she walked into. She had big brown eyes, wild curly hair tied up in a bright pink ribbon, and a laugh that made even the grumpiest teacher smile. That afternoon, she was playing tag with her classmates, running faster than anyone else, arms spread wide like a bird in flight. And then she stopped. One moment, Emma was mid-laughter, and the next, she collapsed to the ground. At first, no one panicked. Kids fall all the time, right? A scraped knee or a bump on the head. Nothing new. But when Emma didn't get back up, the teachers rushed over. Her lips were pale, her eyes fluttered, and her tiny hands trembled. Within minutes, an ambulance arrived, and the once lively playground fell into stunned silence. Her parents, Sarah and Daniel, met her at the emergency room, frantic and wide-eyed. Blood tests were taken. Scans. More tests. Doctors looked puzzled. Hours turned into days. The initial assumption was dehydration or a viral infection, but the truth was far worse than anyone could have imagined. Emma was diagnosed with a rare neurological condition, aggressive and fast-moving. The kind of illness that most doctors only read about in medical journals, the kind with no guaranteed treatment, no clear answers, and worst of all, no time. Specialists were called in from across the state. The hospital became their second home. Machines beeped around the clock, and Sarah rarely left Emma's bedside. When the final results came in, the words no parent should ever hear were gently spoken. "There's nothing more we can do. She may only have days." The words shattered the room. Sarah broke down, clinging to Emma's tiny hand, while Daniel stood frozen, his face pale and blank. The doctors explained the options: comfort care, keeping her pain-free, making the most of the time they had left. But how do you prepare to say goodbye to your child? They brought her favorite blanket, her stuffed giraffe, and most importantly, her dog, Max. From that moment on, the hospital room wasn't filled only with grief. It was filled with love, with quiet stories, whispered songs, and a dog who refused to leave her side. No one knew it yet, but Max wasn't just there to say goodbye. He was there to change everything. Max had been part of the Carter family since Emma was 2 years old. A golden retriever with warm, honey-colored fur and eyes that always seemed to understand more than a dog should. He was a birthday gift, a surprise wrapped in a red bow, and from the very first day, Emma and Max were inseparable. They grew up side by side, learning, playing, even getting into mischief together. If Emma spilled juice, Max was there to lick it up. If she cried, Max rested his head on her lap until the tears stopped. When she was sick, he'd lie beside her bed, refusing to move until she smiled again. He wasn't just a pet. He was her shadow, her protector, her very best friend. So when Emma fell ill and ended up in the hospital, there was no question. Max had to be there. At first, the hospital hesitated. But after hearing Emma's story and seeing the bond they shared, the staff made a rare exception. Max was allowed in, as long as he remained calm. What no one expected was just how serious Max would take his role. From the moment he walked into Emma's hospital room, Max transformed. He didn't wag his tail or sniff around. He walked straight to her bed, climbed up gently beside her, and laid his head on her chest. He barely moved, only lifting his head when nurses came in, watching their every step as if silently reminding them, "Be gentle, she's fragile." He wouldn't eat, wouldn't drink unless Emma did. When they took her for scans, Max paced until she returned. Sometimes he would let out a low whimper, nudging her hand with his nose, trying to get her to respond. He knew something was wrong, and more than that, he felt it. The nurses began to notice. Max would react seconds before Emma's heart rate dropped or spiked. He would bark softly before alarms even went off. One nurse said it was like Max was tuned into her soul. Doctors chalked it up to instinct, but the family saw something else. A connection. A love so deep that not even illness could break it. Emma may have been fading, but Max was fighting for her in the only way he knew how, by staying, by guarding, by loving. And as the days passed, that love began to stir something the doctors never expected. Something impossible to explain. The days bled into one another, each one blurring in the haze of hospital lights and the steady beeping of machines. Emma's room was always filled with the sound of voices, softly spoken words from her parents, the quiet rustle of nurses changing her IV, the gentle hum of medical equipment. But the most consistent sound of all was the low, almost mournful whine of Max, who refused to leave Emma's side. Her condition continued to deteriorate. Her tiny frame grew weaker with every passing hour. The doctors were running out of hope. "It's a miracle if she makes it through the next 48 hours, they told Sarah and Daniel, their voices grave. Max, as if sensing the heaviness of the air, sat silently at the foot of Emma's bed. His golden fur, once vibrant, now looked dulled by exhaustion. He hadn't slept, hadn't eaten, and he refused to leave Emma, even for a moment. His eyes were always locked on her face, his body a constant presence beside her. No one could understand how a dog could have such a connection to a human, especially one so young. But there was something about Max that defied explanation. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting an orange glow over the room, Emma's condition took a sharp turn. Her heartbeat slowed dramatically. Her breathing became labored, shallow. The machines that once beeped in a rhythmic pattern now began to echo with the alarming sounds of distress. The doctors rushed in, their movements swift and practiced, but their expressions said it all. There wasn't much more they could do. The family stood frozen, unable to do anything but watch as the situation spiraled. Max, however, reacted differently. He suddenly stood up, his body tense, and walked over to Emma's side. He nudged her hand with his nose, then let out a soft bark, just one. It wasn't loud or urgent, but it was enough to catch everyone's attention. Sarah looked at him, puzzled. "Max, what is it, boy?" she whispered, but the dog didn't respond in the way she expected. Instead, Max lay down beside her, his head on Emma's chest. He didn't look up. He simply pressed his ear to her heart. For a brief moment, the room fell silent. And then, as if Max's presence was the spark, something miraculous happened. Emma's pulse, once faint, started to steady. Her labored breathing grew slightly deeper. The doctors couldn't explain it. They weren't sure how to react. Was it the medication finally working? Was it the comforting presence of her loyal dog? But whatever it was undeniable. The first sign of hope in days. The night was heavy with tension, the kind of stillness that clung to the walls of Emma's hospital room. Despite the doctor's best efforts, Emma's vitals continued to fluctuate unpredictably. But Max, as always, remained by her side. He hadn't moved from the foot of her bed since that moment when her pulse had stabilized. His eyes were trained on her, unwavering, and his body remained stiff with a kind of quiet urgency. It was around midnight when something unexpected happened. Max suddenly stood up, his fur ruffled and eyes wide with a sense of purpose. He looked down at Emma, then turned toward the door. Without a sound, he padded quietly across the room and paused in front of the door, his tail twitching, his posture tense. It was almost as if he had heard something the rest of them couldn't. Max turned back to Emma and then to the door again. He paced back and forth, his claws clicking against the tile floor, before finally letting out a low whine. It wasn't the kind of sound he usually made. It was more urgent, more desperate, like he was trying to communicate something important. Sarah, who had been sitting at Emma's side, froze when she saw Max's strange behavior. Her eyes followed his every move, trying to make sense of it. Was he reacting to the monitors, to the change in Emma's condition, or was it something else entirely? "Max," Sarah called softly, but the dog didn't look back. He was fixated on the door. His whine grew louder, more insistent. A nurse walked into the room just then, her face tense as she checked the monitors. Max's barking echoed in the hallway, and the nurse turned in confusion. "What's going on, Sarah?" Before Sarah could answer, Max suddenly darted out of the room, his paws tapping urgently against the floor. The nurse's eyes widened in surprise, and she followed him, unsure of what to make of the situation. It was an odd sight. This dog, running down the hall as if he had a mission, like he knew exactly where he was going. Max led her to the nurse's station, where he stopped and began barking again, louder this time, his voice breaking through the silence of the hospital's late-night quiet. The nurse tried to calm him down, but Max wasn't listening. He just kept barking, refusing to stop until the nurse relented and returned with her to Emma's room. When they entered, something had changed. Emma's monitors were suddenly more stable. Her pulse had picked up, her breathing easier. It wasn't a full recovery. Not yet, but it was enough to make the room feel lighter, as if the weight of the last few days had been lifted, even if just for a moment. No one knew what to make of it, but one thing was clear. Max had known something before anyone else did. And in that instant, the family dared to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was still hope. It was early the next morning when the impossible began to happen. Emma's vitals, which had been fluctuating wildly, suddenly seemed to stabilize. The beeping of the machines, once a constant reminder of her fragility, now echoed with a steady rhythm. Her breathing, once shallow and erratic, deepened slightly. Her heart, weak and slow the night before, began to pump with more strength. Sarah and Daniel, exhausted from days of worry, hardly dared to hope. They stood by Emma's bed, not knowing whether to smile or keep their emotions in check. The doctors had already warned them that this wouldn't last, that the illness was relentless and would soon take Emma away. But what they saw now, this small, miraculous change, left them in disbelief. Max, as always, was there. He hadn't moved from his place at the foot of the bed, but his golden eyes were now fixed on Emma with an almost knowing intensity. His tail, which had been motionless for days, slowly began to wag, as though he too recognized the subtle shift in the air. Sarah reached out to touch Emma's hand, her fingers trembling. She wasn't sure if she was seeing what she thought she was seeing, but there it was again, a slight squeeze of Emma's hand, just enough to reassure her mother that her daughter was still there, still fighting. "Emma," Sarah whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Can you hear me, sweetie?" A moment passed. Then, in the softest of voices, Emma responded, "Mom." Her voice was weak, a fragile thread, but it was enough to send a wave of relief through Sarah's chest. "Mom, where's Max?" Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she looked over at the dog, who was now sitting up, his head tilted slightly, ears perked. It was as though Max knew Emma needed him to be closer, and without hesitation, he trotted over and gently placed his head on Emma's lap. "I'm here, sweetheart," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "Max is right here." Emma's eyes fluttered open slightly, her gaze locking with Max. For a moment, it was as if the two of them shared some secret, a silent understanding that no one else could comprehend. Emma smiled weakly, reaching out her hand to stroke Max's soft fur. "Thank you, Max," she whispered, her words barely audible. The dog's tail wagged slowly, and he licked her hand as if to reassure her that he'd never leave. For Sarah and Daniel, this moment was everything. They had been prepared for the worst, but this was something they never expected. In a room filled with medical uncertainty, Max had somehow brought hope back to life. The doctors were still cautious, still unsure of what was happening, but for the first time in days, Sarah dared to believe that her daughter might actually pull through. Max had done more than just comfort Emma. He had given her a reason to fight. And for that, they would be forever grateful. As the days passed, something miraculous began to unfold. Emma's condition, which had once seemed beyond hope, gradually improved in a way that no one could explain. Her breathing grew more steady, her color returned to her cheeks, and the strength she had lost began to trickle back into her tiny body. Every day, her parents watched in awe as Emma made small, yet significant strides. The doctors, initially skeptical, couldn't hide their astonishment. They had expected the worst, preparing the family for a heartbreaking farewell. But instead, they found themselves baffled by the unexpected recovery. Specialists were called in to reassess Emma's condition, but even they struggled to explain the sudden and unexplained improvement. One doctor, after reviewing her charts, shook his head in disbelief. "It's almost like her body is responding in ways we've never seen before. This is, well, it's highly unusual." But the family knew what the doctors couldn't fully grasp. The bond between Emma and Max was not just special, it was powerful. The golden retriever had been by her side through every step of this battle, and his quiet, unwavering presence seemed to bring something deep within Emma to life. The warmth of his body next to hers, the soft nuzzles he offered when she was at her weakest. Everything Max did seemed to give Emma the strength to push forward. Max, of course, didn't care about the doctor's confusion. He had one job: to be there for Emma, no matter what. His devotion never wavered, even as she slowly began to regain some of her energy. He would follow her when she was moved from room to room, always keeping close. He slept beside her at night, always in the same spot, resting his head on her bed, his eyes alert and watchful. One afternoon, when Emma was well enough to sit up in bed, she looked at her parents and smiled, a smile that seemed brighter than anything they had seen in weeks. She looked down at Max, who was resting by her side, and then gently stroked his fur. "You saved me," she whispered, her voice still weak but filled with gratitude. Sarah's eyes welled up with tears as she leaned down and kissed Emma's forehead. "It wasn't just Max, sweetie. You're the one who's been fighting all along." But Emma, even in her weakened state, knew the truth. There was something about Max, the way he had stayed with her when she was at her lowest, the way he had somehow known when she needed help, when she needed to feel loved, that had sparked a change in her. The doctors couldn't explain it, but Emma knew in her heart that Max was her hero. As Emma's recovery continued, it became clear that she wasn't just fighting to survive. She was fighting because she had something worth living for: her family, her future, and most of all, her best friend, Max. The weeks following Emma's miraculous recovery were filled with cautious optimism. Doctors and specialists continued to observe her progress, still unable to fully explain the change in her condition. Emma had gone from being on the verge of death to being able to sit up, eat, and even speak. Her strength returned slowly, but steadily. While the medical community was baffled, the Carter family knew in their hearts that something extraordinary had taken place. It wasn't just medicine or luck that had turned Emma's fate around. It was something deeper, something that defied all scientific explanation. Max had stayed by Emma's side through it all, never once leaving her. And that unwavering presence seemed to have made all the difference. One afternoon, after yet another round of tests, Dr. Lawson, the head physician, sat down with Sarah and Daniel. His expression was serious, but there was a hint of awe in his eyes. "We can't deny the progress your daughter has made," he began, flipping through Emma's chart. "Your daughter was at death's door, and yet she's sitting here today, alive, alert, and improving. But this isn't just the result of medical treatment. The rapid changes we've observed are unlike anything we've seen in cases like hers." Sarah and Daniel exchanged a glance. They had been waiting for the doctors to admit what they had known all along, that Max's presence had played a crucial role in Emma's recovery. But they didn't want to say it out loud, for fear it might sound absurd to the professionals. Dr. Lawson leaned forward, his gaze shifting between the parents. "I don't know how to explain it, but there's something about this dog. Max's constant presence, his behavior, his attentiveness. It's almost like he knew exactly what Emma needed when no one else did." The room fell silent. Sarah wiped her eyes, trying to hold back tears, while Daniel nodded, his heart swelling with gratitude. "It's not just the dog," Daniel said softly. "Max never left her side. He stayed with her when we couldn't. He gave her a reason to keep fighting." The doctor sighed, looking at his clipboard. "It's certainly not scientific," he admitted, "but there's no denying that there's a connection between Max and Emma, something that goes beyond biology. I can't tell you how or why, but I think it's safe to say that this bond played a key role in Emma's recovery. In all my years of practice, I've never witnessed anything like it." Emma, who had been lying quietly in bed, overheard their conversation. She smiled weakly, her eyes glancing at Max, who was lying next to her, as if he'd heard every word. "I knew it," she whispered, stroking his fur. "I knew Max would save me." The doctors couldn't explain the miracle that had happened, but they all agreed on one thing. What Emma had experienced was nothing short of extraordinary. Max wasn't just a dog. He was her guardian, her hero, her unwavering source of love. And for the Carter family, that was enough. They no longer cared about the scientific reasoning behind Emma's recovery. They knew the truth. Love, devotion, and an unbreakable bond had brought her back from the brink. As the days passed, Emma's recovery became a symbol of hope. It wasn't just a miracle, it was a testament to the extraordinary bond between a little girl and her dog. What had once seemed like an impossible battle was now a victory, one that no one could have predicted. The doctors continued to be amazed, but they were also learning something new. Science had its limits, and sometimes there were forces far beyond explanation, like the love of a loyal dog, a bond that transcended everything. Emma's progress was nothing short of miraculous, and while they couldn't fully understand it, they were willing to admit that Max's presence played a significant role in her recovery. Max, for his part, had never left Emma's side. He stayed with her day and night, always close, always watching over her. As she regained her strength, he seemed to know exactly when to nudge her to get up or when to curl up beside her, offering silent support. His affection was never more needed, and he gave it freely, as though he understood the magnitude of what had happened. Emma's laughter began to fill the room again. Her once weak voice grew stronger with each passing day, and her once pale skin regained its healthy glow. She was eating, walking, and slowly but surely reclaiming her childhood. And every step of the way, Max was there. The Carter family, especially Sarah and Daniel, could hardly believe how much had changed in such a short period of time. They had braced themselves for the worst, but now they were looking forward to a future they had thought was impossible, a future with Emma, alive, vibrant, and full of possibilities. One afternoon, as Sarah sat in the park with Emma and Max, she watched as Emma ran alongside Max, her feet kicking up the soft grass. Max ran with her, his tail wagging, his energy as boundless as ever. Emma laughed, her face shining with pure joy as Max darted around her. "Mom, look at me," Emma called, spinning around in a circle. Max followed her, barking happily. Sarah's heart swelled with emotion. She couldn't believe how far they had come, how far Emma had come. The girl who had been on the brink of death was now playing in the park with her best friend, her dog. The bond between them had become something even more powerful than before, a lifeline, a promise, and a reminder that love could heal in ways that science couldn't always explain. Max trotted over to Sarah, sitting by her feet and resting his head on her lap. She smiled down at him, gently scratching behind his ears. "You're more than just a dog, Max," she whispered. "You're family. You're Emma's hero." As Sarah watched Emma and Max play together, she felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Their lives had been forever changed by the love of a dog who refused to give up on the little girl he adored. And while the world might never fully understand the miracle they had witnessed, the Carter family didn't need an explanation. They had their miracle, and they had Max. And that was all they would ever need.